Richard Leonard Kuklinski, aka the Iceman, was an American criminal, a convicted murderer, and one of the most notorious serial killers in history due to his presumably high body count. He was engaged in criminal activities for most of his adult life. He ran a burglary ring and distributed pirated pornography. He committed at least 5 murders between 1980 and 1984. The Iceman lived with his wife and children in a suburb in New Jersey. They knew him as a loving father and husband, although one who also had a violent temper. He was given the nickname Iceman by authorities after they discovered that he had frozen the body of one of his victims in an attempt to disguise the time of death. After his murder convictions, Richard gave interviews to writers, criminologists, psychiatrists, anyone who would listen. He claimed to have worked as a hitman for the mafia and had murdered anywhere from 100 to 200 men, including the presumed murder of Teamsters president Jimmy Hoffa. Hello everybody, welcome to How to Deal. This video is part of our famous serial killers series, and if you enjoy true crime, real crime, or stories where the murderer might have had mental health issues, please like the vid, sub to the page, and share the link to help us continue to grow. Now let's begin. Richard Kuklinski was born on April 11, 1935 in his family's apartment in Jersey City to Stanley Kuklinski, a Polish immigrant, and his mother Anna McNally, a devoted Catholic Irish American. He was the second of 4 children. His younger brother Joseph was convicted in 1970 of raping a 12-year-old and murdering her by throwing her and her dog off the top of a 5-story building. When asked about his brother's crimes, Richard replied, "Well, we come from the same father." According to the Iceman, his father was a violent alcoholic who beat his children regularly and sometimes beat his wife. Stanley abandoned the family while Richard was still a child, but returned periodically, usually drunk, and his returns were often followed by more beatings. In 1940, Stanley's beating resulted in the death of Richard's older brother, then 7-year-old Florian. They hid the cause of death from the authorities, saying he had fallen down some stairs. His mother, Anna, was also often abusive. She would beat Richard with broom handles and other household objects. She believed that strict discipline should be accompanied by a strict religious upbringing. Richard later rejected Catholicism and regarded his own mother as a cancer who destroyed everything she touches. Richard had 2 sons with his first wife, Linda. He met Barbara through his trucking job, divorced Linda, and got remarried in September 1961. He had 2 daughters with Barbara and a son. Barbara described his behavior as alternating between good Richie and bad Richie. Good Richie was an affectionate father and loving husband who enjoyed time with his family. Bad Richie would appear at irregular intervals, sometimes one day after another, other times not appearing for months. He was prone to unpredictable fits of rage. During these periods, he was physically abusive to his wife, one time even breaking her nose, and emotionally abusive towards his children. In the mid-1960s, Richard worked at a Manhattan film lab. Through the lab, he accessed master copies of popular films, and he made bootleg copies of them, including Disney animated films. He also discovered a lucrative market for tapes of pornographic movies. Copying and distributing porn was a regular source of income for him. He was once arrested for passing a bad check, the only crime he was charged with prior to his arrest for murder. The charges were dropped after he agreed to pay back the money he owed. Several of his known murder victims were men he met through trafficking pornography and drugs. He also headed a burglary group with some associates. On January 30, 1980, Richard killed 42-year-old George Malaban Jr. during a meeting to sell him tapes. This was the first known murder linked to Richard. Malaban was reportedly carrying 27,000 at the time. The Iceman shot him 5 times. Malaban's body was discovered a week later inside a 55-gallon drum near a chemical plant in Jersey City. On April 29, 1982, Richard met Paul Hoffman, a 51-year-old pharmacist who occasionally browsed the store, a storefront with a back room holding a wide variety of stolen items for sale in Paterson, New Jersey. Paul hoped to make a big profit by purchasing a popular drug used to treat ulcers and resell them through his pharmacy. Later on, Paul came back with $25,000 to purchase the prescription drugs. Richard met him with a gun to try to shoot him. The gun jammed, and Richard had to beat Paul to death with a tire iron. He then stuffed the body into a 55-gallon drum and left it outside a motel in Little Ferry. One day, Richard noticed that the drum had disappeared, but never learned what happened to it. Paul's body was never recovered. By the early 80s, Richard's burglary gang was under investigation by law enforcement. In December 1982, Percy House, a member of the gang, was arrested. Percy agreed to inform on Richard and was placed in protective custody. Warrants were also issued for the arrest of 2 other gang members, Gary Smith and Daniel Deppner. Richard urged them to lay low and rented them a room in North Bergen. Richard feared that Smith, after he discussed going straight, might become an informant. The gang decided that Smith had to be killed. Richard fed Smith a hamburger laced with cyanide, but when this was slow to work, Daniel Deppner strangled Smith with a lamp cord. They placed the body in between the mattress and a box spring. Over the next 4 days, a number of patrons rented the room, and although they thought the smell in the room was odd, most of them did not think to look under the bed. Finally, on December 27, 1982, after more complaints from guests about the smell, the motel manager finally discovered the decomposing corpse. Richard moved Daniel Deppner after Smith's murder to an apartment in Bergenfield. Sometime between February and May 1983, Daniel was killed by Richard. His body was discovered on May 14, 1983, after a bicyclist riding in a wooded area spotted the corpse surrounded by vultures. The Iceman wrapped the corpse inside green garbage bags before dumping it. Medical examiners listed Deppner's cause of death as undetermined, although they noted some signs of cyanide poisoning and strangulation. Deppner was the third Kuklinski associate to be found dead. On July 1st, 1981, Louis Masquet was to meet Richard at New Jersey diner to purchase a large quantity of blank videocassette tapes, for which Masquet had $95,000 in his van. Richard shot Louis in the back of the head. His body was stored in a freezer, then discovered 15 months later after being dumped near a park in Orangetown, New York. The medical examiner found ice crystals inside the body. The discovery that Richard froze Louis's corpse encouraged law enforcement to nickname him the Iceman. Richard came to the attention of New Jersey State Officer Pat Kane when an informant helped Kane connect him to a gang doing burglaries in northern New Jersey. Kane built a file on Richard. Eventually, 5 unsolved homicides, Maliban, Hoffman, Smith, Deppner, and Masquet, were linked to him because reports say he was the last person to see them alive. A task force titled Operation Iceman was created between New Jersey Attorney General's office and the ATF, who was involved due to Richard's gun sales. Special Agent Dominic Polifrone went undercover for 18 months to apprehend Kuklinski, posing as a mafia-connected criminal. Richard was caught on recordings discussing a corpse he kept in a freezer and boasted about killing a man by putting cyanide in his burger, his preferred method of killing due to it being less messy than others. On December 17, 1986, Kuklinski met Polifrone to get cyanide for a planned murder on an undercover cop. He was stopped and arrested at a roadblock 2 hours later. Prosecutors charged Kuklinski with 5 counts of murder and 6 weapons violations, as well as attempted murder, robbery, and attempted robbery. The Attorney General characterized the motive for the murders as for profit and said he set individuals up for business deals, they disappeared, and the money ended up in his hands. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences at Trenton State Prison and wouldn't have been eligible for parole until 2046, when he would have been 111 years old. During his incarceration, Kuklinski granted interviews to prosecutors, psychiatrists, criminologists, and writers. In various interviews, Kuklinski alleged he was a mafia contract killer, independently working for all the 5 families of New York City. He describes the multiple ways he used to kill people, including a crossbow, ice picks, a bomb attached to a remote-controlled car, guns, grenades, as well as cyanide, considered to be his favorite. He said he committed his first murder at 14 and murdered homeless people for practice. Richard claimed to have murdered around 200 people, although a member of the task force involved in arresting him said he checked every one of the murders Richard said he committed, and not one was true, and authorities could not corroborate one case based on the tidbits the Iceman gave. Several television producers also spoke on Kuklinski about his criminal career and personal life. Richard was interviewed by renowned forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz in 2002. Dietz stated he believed Kuklinski suffered from antisocial personality disorder plus paranoid personality disorder. Richard's cold and calculated methods, which involved various means of killing his victims, make him a perfect example of a serial killer. His willingness to take lives for money, his complete lack of remorse, and his capacity to maintain a double life for decades proves his status as a serial killer. Richard Kuklinski died at the age of 70 on March 5, 2006 due to a cardiac arrest.